My name is Arthur Corrigan. At least that's the name on the driver's license and the social security card the men in the gray suits gave me all those years ago. It's a good name. Solid. Forgettable. It's the name of a man who pays his taxes on time and keeps his lawn neatly trimmed. The name of a man who has no stories to tell. The real Arthur Corrigan, the one who existed before, died in a room in Pasadena in the late summer of 1979. He died listening to a sound from the heavens. I'm just the ghost he left behind, and I'm making this tape because the colors are starting to come back. Just at the edges of my vision. A flicker of something that shouldn't be there when I turn my head too fast. A shimmer in the air over the asphalt on a hot day. The static is returning. They told me this might happen. They called it a neurological echo. A final degradation of the affected tissues. I call it a warning. I don't have much time, and the silence has lasted long enough. The world needs to know what we found out there. Not the sanitized version in the sealed archives at Fort Meade. Not the nonsense about magnetospheric interference they fed to the public. But the truth. The truth about signal designation 734, Project Voyager. The truth about the sound we called Chime. It all started, as most things of that magnitude do, on a day that felt just like any other. A Tuesday, the 28th of August, 1979. The air in the control room at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory always had the same unique smell. It was a layered scent, a kind of technological potpourri. At the bottom, there was the clean, cool, almost sterile smell of the overstressed air conditioning, fighting a losing battle against the California heat and the sheer thermal output of the equipment. Layered on top of that was the distinct warm electric ozone perfume of the IBM System Sharp 360 mainframes that filled the adjacent hall. A constant low thrum you felt more in your bones than you heard with your ears. And finally, the most human layer. The faint, acidic aroma of stale coffee, brewed hours ago and kept perpetually warm on hot plates. The lifeblood of any operation that ran on intellectual rigor and a blatant disregard for the circadian rhythm. I remember that morning so clearly. I was 28 years old, and I felt like I was at the absolute center of the universe. My official title was Lead Audio Telemetry Engineer. It sounded important, and in a way, it was. When the data streams came in from the Deep Space Network, from those colossal dishes in Goldstone or Canberra or Madrid, they were a raw, chaotic jumble of numbers. My job was to take the specific frequencies allocated to acoustic phenomena, the hiss of solar winds, the crackle of a planet's magnetic field, the faint hum of the probe's own internal machinery, and translate them. I cleaned them, filtered them, amplified them, and turned them into something a human ear could process. I gave the void a voice. Most of the time that voice was boring. It was the universe humming to itself. White noise, static, the occasional pop and crackle. But we listened to every second of it, because you never knew. You just never knew. The mood in the room that morning was one of weary anticipation. Voyager 1 was making its closest approach to Jupiter, a gravitational slingshot maneuver that would fling it toward Saturn and eventually out into the interstellar void. It was the culmination of years of work for everyone in that room. At the head of the long bank of consoles sat Dr. Leonard Thorne, the mission director. Len was a man built like a fire hydrant, with a thick neck and a no-nonsense crew cut that hadn't changed since his days in the Air Force. He was perpetually frowning, but it wasn't a frown of anger. It was one of intense, unyielding concentration. He lived and breathed the mission. To his right was Dr. Evelyn Reed, our lead astrophysicist. Evelyn was brilliant, sharp as a tack, and had a way of looking at a screen full of cascading numbers and seeing a story. She saw the physics, the celestial mechanics, the grand, elegant dance of it all. She was the brain, Len was the will. And then there was David Chen, a kid fresh out of Caltech, barely 23. He was one of my junior engineers, a prodigy with a mind that moved so fast you could practically hear it whirring. He had this boundless, infectious optimism that hadn't yet been ground down by the slow, methodical pace of deep space exploration. He still thought every blip on the screen could be first contact. We'd been monitoring the data streams for 72 hours straight, working in shifts. The probe was performing flawlessly. Telemetry was green across the board. The imaging team was getting back those first, breathtaking, high-resolution pictures of the great red spot and the swirling cloud bands. There was a palpable buzz, the feeling of history being made. My own console was quiet. The acoustic telemetry was exactly what we expected. A rising, powerful hiss and roar as Voyager plunged deeper into Jupiter's immense magnetosphere. It was the sound of a god-sized electrical storm, a tempest of charged particles 1,000,000 times more powerful than anything on Earth. It was impressive, but it was just noise. I was logging it, archiving it, running it through the spectral analyzers. Routine. I remember leaning back in my chair, stretching my arms over my head, feeling the crick in my neck from staring at the oscilloscopes for hours. Evelyn rolled her chair over, her eyes tired but bright. "Anything interesting in the static, Art?" she asked, her voice a low murmur under the professional hum of the room. I shook my head, tapping a finger on the green line of the main display. "Just the big guy roaring at us, Ev. Standard magnetospheric symphony. Nothing out of the ordinary." David Chen, from his console 2 seats down, piped up, "Maybe it's saying hello." I chuckled. "If it is, it's got a heck of a sore throat." We all shared a small, tired laugh. It was just another moment in a long series of moments. And then it happened. At 9:47 in the morning, Pacific Daylight Time. It wasn't a loud alarm or a flashing red light. It was something far more subtle and far more disturbing. A single line of code on my diagnostic screen, a flag I had never seen before. It read, "Unexpected data burst, non-telemetry. Source, wideband acoustic sensor. Protocol, mismatch." My heart did a little stutter step. A protocol mismatch meant the data wasn't noise, it wasn't telemetry. It was something else. It was structured. I looked over at Len. "Len, I've got a flag here." A structured data burst on the acoustic channel. He looked over, his frown deepening. "Structured how? Interference from one of the other instruments?" "Negative," I said, my fingers already flying across the keyboard, isolating the data packet. "The timestamp is clean. No corresponding energy spikes on any other sensor. It's isolated to the audio feed, and it's dense. Whatever it is, there's a lot of information packed into it." A ripple of interest went through the room. People started to turn from their own consoles. This was a break in the routine. This was the moment every single one of us secretly lived for. "Put it on a loop, Art," Len commanded, his voice steady. "Isolate the packet and clean it up. Let's see what we've got." I felt a surge of adrenaline, the fatigue of the last 3 days vanishing in an instant. This was my domain. I worked for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes. I stripped away the background hiss of the magnetosphere, ran it through a dozen different noise cancellation filters, and amplified the core signal. The waveform that emerged on my screen was unlike anything I had ever seen. It wasn't the chaotic scribble of natural phenomena. It was elegant. It had a clear, repeating structure, but it was also incredibly complex, with layers and sublayers of harmonic resonance that just shouldn't have been there. It looked less like a sound wave and more like a blueprint for a cathedral. "I've got it isolated, Len," I said, my voice a little tight. "I'm ready to play it back." Len stood up, a sign that this was now the entire room's focus. He walked over to my station, the other senior staff gathering behind him. The air was thick with anticipation. "All right, Art," he said, his eyes locked on the strange, beautiful waveform on my screen. "Pipe it through the main lab speakers. Let's all hear what Jupiter has to say." There's a specific kind of silence that falls over a room full of scientists right before a potential discovery. It's not an empty silence. It's heavy, thick with the combined weight of decades of education, years of research, and a million unanswered questions. It's a silence of pure, unadulterated focus. That was the quiet that descended upon the JPL control room as my finger hovered over the console button that would route the audio to the overhead speakers. I remember the sensation of the cool, worn plastic of the button under my fingertip. I remember taking a breath, a small, unconscious ritual before pushing the button, and in doing so, pushing our world off its axis. I pressed it. For the first second, there was nothing but the faintest hiss of the amplifier circuit powering on. And then, the sound filled the room. It wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. It was crystalline. The best word I've ever been able to find for it is chime. But that word is a pale, pathetic shadow of what the sound actually was. It was a series of clear, piercing notes like a glass bell struck by a silver hammer, but with a resonance that seemed to go on forever. The notes rose and fell in a complex, non-repeating melody that was at once alien and hauntingly, achingly familiar. It had the mathematical precision of a Bach fugue, but the emotional gravity of a whale song. It was a sound that felt intelligent. It was more than just a sound. It had texture. As I listened, I could almost feel it, a strange, phantom sensation of smooth, cool glass against my skin. It had a weight, a presence in the room that was as tangible as the consoles and chairs. The melody was built around a series of harmonic intervals that, according to our understanding of physics and music theory, shouldn't have been able to exist together. They were dissonant and yet perfectly, breathtakingly harmonious. It was a paradox made audible. Around the room, people were frozen. Jaws were slack. Coffee cups were held, forgotten, halfway to lips. Len Thorne stood motionless, his head cocked to one side, his face a mask of pure, stunned disbelief. Evelyn Reed had her eyes closed, as if trying to see the sound with some other sense. David Chen was staring at the main speaker in the corner of the ceiling with an expression of absolute, childlike wonder. For a full minute, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only thing that existed in the universe was this impossible, beautiful, terrifying sound from the orbit of Jupiter. It washed over us, through us. It felt like it was searching for something inside our own minds, a key to a lock we never knew we had. The signal was a short burst, only about 58 seconds long in total. I had it on a continuous loop. After the third or fourth repetition, the initial shock began to wear off, replaced by a frantic, buzzing excitement. "My God," Evelyn whispered, her eyes fluttering open. "The complexity, the harmonic structure it's not natural. It can't be." "Run a comparison against all known pulsar signals," Len barked, snapping back into his role as director. "Check for any possible reflection or distortion from the probe itself. I want every natural explanation for this on my desk in an hour." People started moving, a flurry of activity, but it was distracted. Their eyes kept flicking up toward the speakers. No one could ignore the chime. It was the center of gravity in the room now. I was running my own diagnostics, my fingers a blur on the keyboard. I was trying to deconstruct it, to break it down into its base frequencies, but the computer kept kicking back errors. The signal was too complex. The data density was off the charts. It was like trying to fit the entire Library of Congress onto a single Post-it note. The sound was information, but it was encoded in a language we had no way of understanding. I remember feeling a strange sense of violation, as if we were eavesdropping on a conversation we were never meant to hear. A conversation between what? The melody continued its looping hypnotic dance. It was starting to get under my skin, to resonate in my skull. I felt a weird pressure behind my eyes, a faint, high-pitched ringing in my ears that was separate from the sound coming from the speakers. I shook my head trying to clear it. I was probably just tired, I told myself. Too much coffee, not enough sleep. I focused on my screen, trying to build a new filter from scratch, one that could handle the signal's impossible density. The chime played on. It was beautiful, utterly, undeniably beautiful. And I think, deep down, that's what scared us the most. The void wasn't supposed to be this beautiful. It was supposed to be empty and cold. But this was art. And art implies an artist. The loop must have played for at least 15 minutes. 15 solid minutes of that impossible crystalline music filling every corner of the room, every corner of our minds. The initial frantic burst of activity had subsided into a state of quiet, obsessive work. Everyone was at their station, hunched over, running analyses, but no one was really concentrating. We were all just listening. The chime had become the atmosphere. It was the air we were breathing. I was deep into a spectral analysis, watching the complex wave patterns scroll down my screen when David Chen made a sound. It was a small, sharp gasp, like someone who'd just been pricked with a needle. I glanced over at him. He was sitting bolt upright in his chair, but he wasn't looking at his console. He was staring, with a kind of rapt intensity, at the large, blank, white projection screen on the far wall. It was a retractable screen we used for briefings, and right now, it was just an empty, white rectangle. "Who's doing that?" David asked, his voice sounding thin and distant. Len looked up from a printout he was studying. "Doing what, son?" David didn't look away from the wall. He raised a slightly trembling hand and pointed. "The projector." "Who's running the color projector?" "It's beautiful." I followed his gaze. There was nothing on the screen. It was just a plain, white, vinyl surface, reflecting the mundane fluorescent lights of the room. There was no projector running. The main ceiling-mounted unit was off, its lens cap firmly in place. "David, there's no projector on," Len said, his voice patient, like he was talking to a confused child. "The screen is blank." "No?" David insisted, shaking his head slowly, a mesmerized smile touching his lips. "No, it's not blank. Look, right there, in the middle. That color." He gestured again, more emphatically this time. "What do you call that? It's like green, but it's warm. It's the color of the fifth note in the sequence." A cold, heavy dread began to uncoil in the pit of my stomach. I looked at the screen again, trying to see what he was seeing. Nothing. White. I looked at Evelyn. She was staring at David with a clinical, worried expression. "David," she said softly, her voice calm and analytical. "There is nothing on that screen. The spectral reflectance is uniform, standard white." "You don't see it?" David's voice was filled with a genuine, profound bewilderment. He looked around the room, from my face to Len's to Evelyn's, his eyes wide with disbelief. "How can you not see it? It's right there. It's so bright." He turned back to the wall, his focus absolute. He started to describe it. And that was when the real horror began. He wasn't describing a color we knew. He was using words that didn't belong together, creating impossible, paradoxical descriptions. It's heavy," he whispered, his voice full of awe, like the feeling of wet velvet. "But it shimmers, and it tastes like like ozone, like the air after a lightning strike. It's a loud color. Can't you hear it? A total, profound silence fell over the room, a silence made even deeper by the chime that was still playing, still weaving its beautiful alien melody around us. We were all staring at David. He had become the anomaly. He was a scientist, a man of logic and reason, and he was describing a sensory experience that was physically impossible. He was claiming to see a color on a blank wall, a color that had a texture, a taste, and a sound. Evelyn took a step toward him. "David," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "I think we need to turn the signal off." David's head snapped around to face her, and for the first time, there was a flash of something ugly in his eyes, a possessive, panicked look. "No," he said, his voice suddenly sharp. "Don't. If you turn it off, the color might go away." He looked back at the wall, a desperate hunger in his expression. "I don't want it to go away. I've never seen anything so beautiful." I felt a shiver trace its way down my spine. The chime was still playing. The sound was still filling the room. And I suddenly had the horrifying thought that it wasn't just a sound. It was a key, and it had just found a lock in David Chen's mind. It was opening a door that was supposed to stay shut forever. Len Thorne, his face grim, walked over to my console. He didn't say a word. He just pointed at the button to cut the audio feed. I looked from his hard, set face to David, who was now muttering to himself, describing the shifting patterns of his impossible color, a blissful, insane smile on his face. My hand was shaking as I reached for the button. The chime felt like it was physically pushing back, a pressure in my head telling me not to do it, promising me I could see the color too, if I just kept listening. I slammed my finger down on the button, and the room was plunged back into that thick, humming, technological silence. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. It was a dead, hollow quiet, ringing with the ghost of the chime's melody. The absence of the signal was a physical presence in the room. I could feel the space it had occupied, a void in the air. For a few seconds, everyone was frozen. David Chen let out a small, wounded cry, like a child whose favorite toy had just been taken away. "You turned it off," he whimpered, his eyes still fixed on the white screen. "It's fading. It's going." He looked genuinely heartbroken. Len walked over to him and placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Son, you need to come with me. Let's go to the infirmary. Get you checked out." David shook him off, his eyes wide with a strange mix of terror and ecstasy. "But you don't understand," he pleaded, looking around at all of us. "It was real. I saw it." Evelyn stepped forward, her face a mixture of scientific curiosity and deep concern. "David, what you experienced was likely a form of auditory visual synesthesia, induced by the unusual frequency modulation of the signal. It's a known, though rare, neurological phenomenon." Her voice was a rock of rationality in a sea of madness, but her explanation, as logical as it was, felt thin and inadequate. Synesthesia. People with synesthesia might see the number 7 as being yellow, or hear a trumpet and taste oranges. They associate one sense with another, but they don't perceive things that don't exist. They don't invent new colors. David wasn't just associating the sound with an existing color. He was describing a new one, a color that defied description, that had properties of texture and temperature. That wasn't synesthesia. That was a software update for the human brain. And David had been the first to finish installing it. Evelyn was about to say something else when she stopped. Her mouth hung slightly open. A strange, unfocused look came into her eyes. She slowly turned her head and looked at the same blank, white wall that David had been staring at. "Oh my God," she whispered. The words were barely audible. Len turned to her. "Evelyn, What is it?" "It didn't go away," she said, her voice filled with a dawning, horrified wonder. I can still see the echo of it. A residue. It's faint, but it's there." She took a staggering step back, her hand flying to her mouth. She, too, was now staring at the wall as if it were the most fascinating object in the world. "It's not green," she murmured, contradicting David's earlier description. "It's fire. That's the only word that comes to mind. It's the color of a flame that burns without heat. It feels static, like the charge in the air before a storm. It was spreading, like a contagion. I felt a wave of pure, primal fear wash over me. This wasn't a psychological quirk. This was an effect. The signal had done something to them. It had planted a seed in their minds, and even with the sound gone, that seed was starting to sprout. I looked at Len. The color was draining from his face. He was a man of action, a man who understood rockets and trajectories and orbital mechanics. This was something else. This was a ghost in his machine, and he had no protocol for it. He looked around the room at the other 24 engineers and technicians. Most of them just looked confused, bewildered by the behavior of their superiors. But a few of them had that same distant, focused look in their eyes. They were starting to look at the blank walls, at the white ceiling tiles, their heads cocked at strange angles. The infection was silent, and it was moving through the room. And then it happened to me. It didn't start with a flash. It started with the ghost of the chime in my ears. The melody was still there, a faint, perfect echo in my auditory cortex. And as the phantom notes rose and fell, a strange shimmering began to appear at the edge of my vision. I tried to shake it off, blinking hard, telling myself it was an after image from staring at the bright green oscilloscopes for too long. But it didn't go away. The shimmering grew stronger, coalescing. I slowly, reluctantly, turned my head to look at the white wall, and I saw it. It wasn't what David had described, or what Evelyn had named. My mind, my brain, interpreted it differently. For me, it was a color that can only be described as a hole in reality. It was a patch on the wall, about the size of a dinner plate, that was the visual equivalent of absolute silence. It was a deep, velvety, impossible shade that wasn't black, because it didn't absorb light. It negated it. It was a patch of non-existence. Looking at it made my eyes water, my brain ache. It was a flat, two-dimensional shape that somehow had an infinite depth. I felt like if I stared at it for too long, I would fall into it. My mind recoiled from it, fighting to process the sensory input. It was like trying to divide by zero. The color, this non-color, was a logical paradox that my visual cortex was trying and failing to solve. A wave of vertigo and nausea washed over me. I gripped the edge of my console to keep from falling out of my chair. My name for it came to me instantly. A word I didn't know I knew. Static void, I breathed. All three of us, David, Evelyn, and I, had seen something. And all three of us had seen something different, yet born from the same source. The chime wasn't a uniform message. It was a catalyst. It didn't show us something. It forced our own brains to create something. It was a raw data stream, just as the psychiatrist's note would later say, for a visual cortex different from our own. And in the absence of the proper hardware, our primitive, ape-descended brains were doing the best they could, filling in the gaps with their own unique brands of beautiful, terrifying madness. The silence in the room was now absolute. Everyone, every single person, was seeing it. Each one of us trapped in our own private, silent light show, staring at the walls of the JPL control room as they came alive with colors that had no names and no right to exist. The initial awe, the terrifying religious wonder, lasted for perhaps an hour. An hour of silent individual communion with the impossible. We were like a room full of mesmerized statues, each lost in a perceptual world no one else could fully share. David Chen was weeping silently, tears streaming down his face, a look of ecstatic agony on his face as he watched his warm, velvet green. Evelyn was pacing back and forth, her lips moving, muttering complex equations to herself, trying to define the physics of her heatless ulfire. I remained frozen in my chair, unable to tear my eyes away from the patch of static void, the beautiful silent hole that had opened in reality on the wall in front of me. The hunger started subtly. It wasn't a physical hunger for food, but a deeper, more primal craving. The color was in my head. A perfect, vivid, high-resolution image burned into my mind's eye. But it was fleeting. The after-image, the neurological echo of the chime, was already beginning to fade. The edges of my static void were starting to soften, the impossible depth becoming shallower, and I was overcome with a sudden, desperate, clawing panic at the thought of losing it. I couldn't lose it. It was the most profound thing I'd ever experienced, and the thought of returning to a world without it was unbearable. It would be like a man who had seen the face of God being forced to spend the rest of his life in a windowless room. I looked around and saw the same panic dawning on the faces of my colleagues. David had stopped weeping and was now looking around the room with a wild, desperate energy. Evelyn had stopped pacing and was staring at her own hands as if she had never seen them before. The shared, unspoken thought rippled through the room. We have to save it. We have to capture it. We have to make it real. It was Evelyn, the rational scientist, who made the first move. She strode over to a large corkboard where mission schedules and notices were pinned. She pulled a handful of colored thumbtacks from the board, red, blue, yellow, green, and hurried back to her desk. She crushed them under the weight of a heavy coffee mug, grinding the colored plastic into a rough powder. Then she started trying to mix them on a piece of white paper, her movements frantic, obsessive. She was trying to create ulfire from the mundane palette of the physical world. It was a fool's errand. It was like trying to build a starship out of mud and sticks. A moment later, David Chen was at the supply cabinet, tearing it open. He grabbed colored markers, highlighters, anything with a pigment. He started scribbling frantically on a whiteboard, laying down layer after layer of color, a chaotic mess of green and yellow and blue, trying to find the specific, impossible hue that existed only in his head. The control room, the sterile, professional heart of America's space program, began its rapid descent into a madhouse. Someone found a set of architectural pastels in a forgotten desk drawer. Another engineer started breaking open ballpoint pens, smearing the ink on his fingers and then onto the wall. I was swept up in it too. The fear of losing the static void was a physical pain. I needed to see it again, not just in my mind, but in the world. I remembered the maintenance closet down the hall. I ran from the room, my heart pounding, a singular, obsessive thought driving me. Paint. I needed paint. I found a small collection of old, half-used cans of latex paint on a shelf, a stark, institutional white, a dull battleship gray, a faded safety yellow, and a can of what was once black but had thickened into a tarry sludge. It didn't matter. They were pigments. They were tools. I hauled them back to the control room, my hands shaking. The scene that greeted me was one of pure, unadulterated chaos. The room was a whirlwind of desperate, failed artistry. People were smearing colors on the walls, on the consoles, on their own faces. The air was thick with the smell of ink and solvents and a rising collective human scent of sweat and despair. I tore the lid off the can of black paint with a screwdriver. The smell of chemicals was sharp, acrid, I dipped my fingers into the thick, cold goo and turned to a clean section of the wall. I tried to paint the static void, but it was impossible. Black paint absorbs light. My static void didn't. Black paint has a texture, a physical presence. My static void was an absence. The more black paint I smeared on the wall, the more pathetic and insulting my attempt became. It was a crude, ugly parody of the perfect, terrifying beauty in my mind. A frustrated, guttural sob escaped my throat. It wasn't working. It could never work. We were trying to replicate a fourth-dimensional object using third-dimensional tools. We were cavemen trying to paint a sunset on a rock with charcoal and berry juice. The fundamental colors of the universe, the reds, the greens, the blues, governed by the simple physics of light waves and photoreceptors, were a hopelessly inadequate language to describe what we had seen. We had been shown a page from God's own coloring book, and we were trying to copy it with a cheap box of 8 crayons. The despair was a palpable thing in the room. The initial frantic energy was curdling into rage and grief. Someone threw a handful of markers against the wall, shouting in frustration. Evelyn was on her knees, staring at the meaningless smudge of colored dust she had made, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Len Thorne was just standing in the middle of it all, his face ashen, his eyes vacant. He was watching his team, his brilliant, rational, hand-picked team of the best minds in the country, tear themselves apart over a ghost of a color. He was the captain of a ship that was not only sinking, but had dissolved into impossible geometry around him. The Chime had been a stone thrown into the placid pond of our reality. And now, we were all drowning in the ripples. The breakdown was not a swift, clean snap. It was a slow, grinding erosion of sanity, like water dripping on a stone. The control room had become our asylum, and we were its willing inmates. The obsessive need to replicate the colors didn't fade, it festered. When the paints and markers failed us, we turned to other things. An electronics engineer, a man named Bill, started dismantling a color television monitor. He was convinced that if he could just isolate the cathode ray gun and manipulate the magnetic yokes with enough precision, he could force the phosphors to glow with the right frequency. He sat in a corner for hours, surrounded by a tangle of wires and capacitors, zapping himself with static electricity, muttering about electron valences and color temperatures. He was trying to build a machine to see his own hallucination. 2 junior scientists from the imaging department, a young couple who had started dating during the Pioneer missions, had a different approach. They were convinced the color was a combination of light and shadow. They started tearing down ceiling panels, unscrewing light fixtures, trying to create the perfect specific interplay of light and dark in a corner of the room that would reveal the hue they both saw. A shimmering silvery blue that they said felt cold and sharp, like broken glass. They argued, their voices rising about the precise angle of a shadow, the exact lumens required. Their shared vision was tearing them apart. The psychological pressure was immense, but it was the physiological effects that were the most disturbing. We stopped sleeping. Sleep felt like a betrayal of the memory of the color. To close your eyes was to risk it fading further. We stopped eating. Food was a dull, gray, tasteless distraction from the vibrant, impossible world in our heads. We were running on nothing but adrenaline, obsession, and the dregs of that stale, cold coffee. People grew gaunt, their eyes ringed with dark circles, their skin pale and waxy under the fluorescent lights. We looked like ghosts, haunted by a beauty we couldn't possess. My own obsession with the static void grew more intense, more personal. I stopped trying to paint it. I knew that was pointless. My new theory was that the color wasn't a pigment, but a state of matter, an absence. I started collecting all the black objects I could find. The plastic housing of a telephone, a black 3-ring binder, a roll of electrical tape. I arranged them on my console, creating a small, pathetic shrine to the void. I would sit for hours, staring at them, trying to see the subtle differences in their blackness, hoping to find a hint, a clue, to the perfect, light-devouring nothingness of the static void. My colleagues gave me a wide berth. I had become the high priest of the color of absence, and my quiet, intense mania was, I think, even more frightening than the loud, frantic despair of the others. The collapse of Len Thorne was the fulcrum on which the whole tragedy pivoted. He had resisted the longest. For the first day, he tried to be the director. He tried to reason with us, to order us, to plead with us. He made calls to NASA headquarters, his voice low and strained, trying to explain the unexplainable. I could only imagine the response he was getting. Mission Director Thorne reports his entire team is finger painting. They must have thought he'd gone insane. But the chime had infected him too. He was just better at hiding it. I saw him, late on the second night, when he thought everyone else was asleep, or lost in their own worlds. He was standing in front of the main projection screen, the one where David had first seen his color. Len was holding a small, powerful flashlight, shining it on the blank white vinyl. He was moving the beam back and forth, changing the angle, his breath held tight in his chest. He was hunting for his own ghost. He was trying to catch a glimpse of the color he had been denying for 48 hours. The moment I saw him do that, I knew we were truly lost. If Len had fallen, there was no hope for any of us. The final catastrophic breakdown happened on the third day. It was David Chen. He had been the first to see a color, and his mind had been steeped in it the longest. He had grown increasingly agitated, his optimism curdling into a twitchy, paranoid rage. His color, the one he described as a warm velvet green, had become a tormentor. He claimed it was teasing him, appearing vividly for a moment and then vanishing. He was in a state of constant, agonizing withdrawal. He burst into the middle of the room, his eyes wild, his hair matted with sweat. He was holding a fire extinguisher. "I know how to do it!" he screamed, his voice raw and cracking. "It's not about adding color. It's about what you take away." Before anyone could react, he aimed the nozzle at the main bank of IBM server racks that controlled the room's environmental systems and pulled the lever. A massive, thick cloud of white carbon dioxide foam erupted from the extinguisher, blanketing the multi-million-dollar computer systems. Alarms shrieked to life, loud, piercing, painfully real. Red emergency lights began to flash, plunging the room into a strobing, hellish twilight. "The white!" David shrieked over the alarms, a mad, triumphant grin on his face. "If I make everything perfectly white, the color will have to show itself. It will have nowhere else to hide." The foam hit the hot electronics and there was a series of loud, explosive pops. Sparks flew. The main lights flickered and died. The emergency lights stuttered and went out, plunging us into absolute terrifying darkness. The only sound was the dying wail of the alarms as the backup batteries failed, and the frantic, gasping breaths of 32 people who had just been sealed in a tomb of their own making. The darkness was absolute. It was a thick, suffocating blanket, made heavier by the sudden, shocking silence. The alarms were gone. The hum of the mainframes was gone. The very breath of the building had ceased. The only sounds were the ragged, panicked breathing of the people around me and the slow, wet dripping of the fire extinguisher foam onto the floor. In that moment, the colors vanished. The beautiful, terrible, mind-breaking hues that had haunted us for 3 days were snuffed out by the pure, primitive, animal fear of being trapped in the dark. The obsession was momentarily purged by a more immediate terror. For the first time in 72 hours, my mind was blessedly, horrifyingly empty. A few people started to scream. Others were crying softly. Someone near me was hyperventilating, the sound unnervingly loud in the blackness. The smell was awful. Acrid smoke from the fried circuits, the chemical tang of the CO2 foam, and the sour scent of collective fear. We had done it. We had finally, irrevocably, broken our world. My first thought was of the doors. They were electronically controlled. With the main power out and the backup systems fried, they would be locked, sealed. We were trapped. The thought hit me with the force of a physical blow. I felt my own breath catch in my chest, a cold knot of panic tightening in my stomach. Len Thorne's voice cut through the darkness, and it was a sound I will never forget. It wasn't the voice of a director. It was the voice of a soldier in a lost battle, a voice stripped of all authority, holding on by a single thread of training and will. "Nobody move," he commanded, his voice shaking but loud. "Stay where you are. We have emergency flashlights in the supply kits. Sound off if you know where one is." His words had a calming effect. It was a procedure. It was an order. It was something to cling to in the chaos. A few voices answered him out of the dark. I remembered there was a kit under my own console. I dropped to my hands and knees, my fingers fumbling blindly in the dark. The floor was sticky with something. Spilled coffee, paint. I didn't know. My hand brushed against the cool metal of the emergency kit. I found the latch, pulled it open, and my fingers closed around the familiar ribbed plastic of a heavy-duty flashlight. I clicked it on. The beam cut a sharp, dusty cone through the darkness, and what it revealed was a scene from hell. The room was a disaster zone. Papers and wires and broken equipment were everywhere. The walls were a nightmarish mural of smeared, meaningless colors. And the people, their faces were pale, streaked with grime and paint, their eyes wide with shock and fear in the sudden, harsh light. They looked like the survivors of a shipwreck. One by one, other flashlights clicked on, their beams crisscrossing the room, creating a frantic, disorienting web of light and shadow. We found David Chen huddled against the dead server racks, sobbing, rocking back and forth. The mad triumph was gone, replaced by the devastating, crushing weight of what he had done. We were alive. We were trapped. And the outside world had no idea what had happened inside room 204. Our self-imposed quarantine had just become a very real prison. But the real horror came about an hour later. The fear had subsided into a grim, exhausted quiet. We were just sitting there, in the dark, waiting. For what? We didn't know. And in that quiet, as our minds began to settle, the colors started to come back. Faintly at first, a shimmer in the corner of my eye. A trace of that impossible fire in the reflection off a piece of chrome. The Chime had done more than just plant a suggestion. It had permanently rewired us. The hardware had been altered. And in the dark, with no other visual stimuli to distract our brains, the phantoms burned even brighter. The madness was still there. It had just been waiting in the wings. And then, we heard the sound. A heavy, metallic thud from the main corridor. Then another. It was the sound of the locking bolts on the main security doors being engaged. From the outside, someone was locking us in. A new wave of fear, cold and sharp, washed over the room. We weren't just trapped by a power failure. We were being sealed in. I ran to the main door, others following, our flashlight beams bouncing wildly. I put my ear to the cold steel. I could hear footsteps, the calm, measured tread of several people. And then, a voice, muffled but clear. Clinical. Containment protocol initiated. Site is on full lockdown. No entry, no exit. Await further instructions. It wasn't one of the facility security guards. I knew all their voices. This was someone new. Someone whose voice carried an authority that felt heavier, older, and far more dangerous than anything at JPL. We started banging on the door, shouting, screaming that we were trapped inside. There was no response, just the sound of those footsteps receding down the hall until there was only silence. They knew we were in here, and they had locked us in anyway. We weren't being rescued. We were being quarantined. We were the disease. And the room, our whole world for the past 3 days, had just officially become our tomb. That was when the men in the dark suits arrived, not with keys, but with cutting torches and gas masks, and the real nightmare, the one that would last the rest of my life, began. They moved with a chilling efficiency, flooding the room with a sweet-smelling gas that made our limbs feel heavy and our thoughts slow to a crawl. The last thing I saw before I blacked out was a man in a pristine black suit, holding no flashlight, staring at the wall where my static void had been. He was looking at it with an expression of recognition. He wasn't surprised at all. He had seen it before. Waking up was a slow, syrupy process. The first sense to return was smell, a sterile antiseptic scent that reminded me of a hospital, but cleaner, colder. It lacked the underlying human notes of sickness and decay. This was the smell of a laboratory. The second sense was touch. A coarse, starchy blanket was pulled up to my chin. The sheet underneath it was crisp and cool. I was lying on a narrow, firm mattress. I tried to open my eyes, but my eyelids felt like they were made of lead. A deep, profound exhaustion permeated every cell in my body, a bone weariness that went far beyond lack of sleep. It was the exhaustion of a mind that had been pushed past its breaking point and was only now being allowed to rest. I finally managed to pry my eyes open. I was in a small, perfectly square room. The walls, ceiling, and floor were uniform, seamless, matte gray. There was no window. There was no decoration. The only object in the room besides the simple bed I was on was a single gray chair. The only source of light was a soft, indirect glow that seemed to emanate from the ceiling itself. There was no visible fixture. I sat up. I was wearing a simple, gray, pajama-like garment. I looked at my hands. They were clean. The paint, the ink, the grime, it was all gone. I felt my face. The days of stubble had been shaved away. I had been cleaned, processed. My mind felt quiet. For the first time since hearing the chime, the phantom colors were gone. The neurological echo was silent. My brain was a clean slate, but it felt terrifyingly empty. The memory was there, but the raw sensory experience had been scrubbed away, leaving a dull ache in its place. The door to the room made no sound as it opened. 2 men walked in. They were not wearing black suits anymore. They were dressed in simple, anonymous, dark gray business suits, the kind that are designed to be forgotten the moment you look away. They had no features that stood out. They were not tall or short, not old or young. They were perfectly, terrifyingly average. One of them sat down in the chair. The other remained standing by the closed door, his hands clasped behind his back. The one in the chair held a thin file. He opened it, but he didn't look at it. He looked at me. His eyes were the color of a winter sky. "Arthur Corrigan," he said. It wasn't a question. "We need to talk about what happened at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory." His voice was calm, monotone, without a trace of emotion. It was the voice of a man who was not interested in my feelings, my fear, or my experiences. He was interested only in information. "Where am I?" I asked. My own voice sounded rusty, unused. "That is not relevant," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "Where are my colleagues? Dr. Thorne? Dr. Reed?" "They are being attended to," he said, the phrase carrying a chilling, sterile ambiguity. "Let's talk about the signal. Designation 734. And so began the debriefing. It was not an interrogation. An interrogation implies a desire to uncover the truth. This was something else entirely. This was a re-education, a reprogramming. He never asked me, "What did you see?" He asked, "Can you describe the visual artifacts caused by the magnetospheric feedback loop?" He never asked, "What did the chime sound like?" He asked, "Can you confirm that the anomalous audio was a result of a cascading harmonic distortion from the probe's own power systems?" They already had the story written. They just needed me to sign my name at the bottom. I tried to tell them the truth. I told them about the complexity of the signal, its intelligent structure. The man just nodded slowly, as if listening to the predictable ramblings of a child. A common side effect of prolonged exposure to infrasonic resonance is the perception of patterns in random noise, he said, his voice flat. The human brain is hardwired to find meaning where there is none. I told him about the colors, about David's velvet green, Evelyn's heatless ulfire, my own static void. I described the shared yet individual nature of the hallucinations. "Mass hysteria, Mr. Corrigan," the man said without blinking, "amplified by sleep deprivation and psychological stress. A well-documented phenomenon. You saw what you were primed to see by your colleague's initial outburst. Every truth I offered him, he had a neat, tidy, pseudo-scientific explanation for. An explanation that was plausible, logical, and a complete and utter lie. He was not trying to understand my reality. He was trying to overwrite it with his own. The gas they had used on us, I realized, had done more than just knock us out. It must have been some kind of advanced amnestic or neural suppressant. It had dampened the signal's effect, pushed it deep down into the recesses of our minds. They were trying to convince me that the most profound experience of my life had been nothing more than a bad dream, a trick of a tired mind. The most terrifying part was that a small part of me wanted to believe him. It was an easy way out. To accept their version of events was to accept that I wasn't broken, that the universe was still the same safe, predictable place it had been before. This went on for days, or maybe weeks. Time had no meaning in that gray room. They brought me food on a gray tray. They asked me the same questions over and over, their voices never changing, their expressions never faltering. They showed me documents, technical reports written by people I'd never heard of, all of which concluded that the JPL incident was a textbook case of equipment malfunction and crew fatigue. They showed me a psychiatric evaluation of myself, a document I had never seen, signed by a doctor I had never met. It described me as a highly suggestible individual with a predisposition for obsessive-compulsive behavior. It was the infamous psychiatrist's note that would later be leaked, but its origin was far more sinister. It wasn't a doctor's observation, it was a character assassination, written before the interview even began. The key line was there, buried in a paragraph of clinical jargon. The subject's hallucinations are not indicative of a standard psychotic break, but rather a profound misinterpretation of sensory data. He seems to describe the signal not as a sound, but as a raw data stream for a visual cortex different from our own, a concept his mind manufactured to cope with the anomalous input. They had even co-opted my own terror, twisted it into a symptom of my own supposed madness. Finally, after an eternity in that gray room, I broke. I was exhausted, disoriented, and my own memory of the event was beginning to feel distant, unreal, just as they wanted. It was interference, I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. It was magnetospheric interference. We were tired. We panicked. The man in the chair finally closed his file. A flicker of something that might have been satisfaction crossed his face for a fraction of a second. "Good," he said. "That is the correct and final assessment. You will be placed on indefinite medical leave from NASA. A generous pension has been arranged. You will be given a new identity, a new home, a new life. You will not contact any of your former colleagues. You will not speak of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, Project Voyager, or Signal 734 to anyone, ever. Do you understand? I nodded, my head bowed in defeat. I understand. He stood up. We know this has been difficult, Mr. Corrigan, but it's for the best. Some things are not for public consumption. Humanity is not ready. He and the other man walked to the door. Just before he left, he paused and looked back at me. One last piece of advice, he said, his voice dropping to an almost conspiratorial whisper. Stay away from art galleries, and try not to stare at blank walls. The echo can linger. And then he was gone, leaving me alone in the silence of my new, gray life. They gave me a life in Phoenix, Arizona. The city, they explained, was good for people with respiratory complaints. A cover story for the lung irritation caused by the fire extinguisher foam. The real reason I knew was the sun. Phoenix is a city bleached by sunlight, a place of stark, bright, simple colors, a city with very few shadows. It was the opposite of the deep, complex darkness of space. It was a safe place for a mind like mine. My new name was Robert Paulson. I was a retired accountant. I had a small beige stucco house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. I had a bank account with a comfortable amount of money in it. I had a backstory, a fabricated history of a quiet, unremarkable life. I was a ghost, given a new, ill-fitting skin. The first few years were a blur of numb, gray routine. I did what I was told. I kept to myself. I mowed my lawn. I paid my bills. I tried to forget. I tried to be Robert Paulson. But Arthur Corrigan wouldn't stay dead. He was there in the quiet moments. He was there when I heard a strange chime on a television commercial, a sound that would make my heart seize in my chest. He was there when I saw a child's drawing with a strange, unnameable color scribbled in the sky, and I'd have to fight the urge to run. The world had become a minefield of potential triggers. I lived in a state of low-grade, constant paranoia. I felt like I was being watched, and I probably was. For the first 5 years, I would occasionally see them. A plain brown sedan parked down the street for a few hours. A man in a gray suit at the far end of a grocery store aisle who would turn away the moment I saw him. They were just checking on their investment, making sure their ghost wasn't rattling its chains too loudly. I tried to find out what happened to the others. It was a foolish, dangerous thing to do, but I had to know. I used the nascent early internet of the 1980s, dialing up to bulletin board systems from the public library using anonymous accounts. It was slow, painstaking work. Most of the trails were cold, their records sealed or erased, but I found fragments, whispers. Len Thorne, I learned, had officially died of a massive coronary just 6 weeks after the incident. He was 53 years old. His family was told it was the stress of the job. I knew better. I believe they silenced him. He was the director. He knew too much, and he was too strong-willed to be reprogrammed as easily as the rest of us. Evelyn Reed was a harder story to trace. Her academic records, her publications, her entire existence had been scrubbed. But I found a mention of her in an obscure physics forum. A former colleague was asking if anyone knew what had happened to the brilliant Dr. Reed from JPL. A single anonymous reply appeared a week later. It just said, "She's in a private sanatorium in upstate New York, a place for special cases. Don't go looking." I imagined her there, in a quiet room, still trying to write the equations for the color of a flame that burns without heat. David Chen, the kid, the first one to see the Chime's gift. His story was the saddest. I found his obituary in a digitized archive of a small-town California newspaper. He had died just a year after the incident. The cause of death was listed as suicide. He had hanged himself in his parents' garage. The article mentioned he had been suffering from a severe, undiagnosed schizophrenic disorder, with complex visual hallucinations. They had let him go, and his mind, without their suppressants, had been consumed by the beauty he could no longer replicate or escape. He had seen a new color, and the sight had killed him. I was the survivor, the lucky one. They had chosen me to live this quiet, gray life of forgetting. Why me? I've asked myself that question a million times. Maybe because I was the audio engineer. I was the most pliable, the one who dealt in the abstract world of sound, not the hard physics of Evelyn, or the command structure of Len. Or maybe, just maybe, they knew the static void I had seen, the color of absence, was the closest to the truth. And that truth was so terrifying, so profoundly empty, that it would be its own prison. The years turned into decades. The 1980s bled into the 90s. The world changed. The Cold War ended. The internet exploded. But I stayed the same. A man living in a beige house, haunted by a color that didn't exist. The gray suits stopped appearing. They decided I was no longer a threat. I was just a quiet old man with a strange phobia of modern art. I had become Robert Paulson, for good. The grayness of my new life was its own kind of hell, but it was a quiet hell, a manageable one. Until now. I am an old man now. My hands tremble when I hold a coffee cup. My back aches in the morning. The face that looks back at me from the mirror is a stranger's, a roadmap of a life I never truly lived. Robert Paulson's life. It's a lonely existence, but I made my peace with it. Or so I thought. About 6 months ago, it started. A flicker, just at the very edge of my right eye. A tiny, momentary shimmer of that deep, silent, light-devouring nothingness. The static void. I dismissed it at first. A floater. A trick of old eyes. But it happened again the next day. And the day after. The suppressants they used on me, the chemical cage they built around that part of my memory, is failing. After 40 years, the walls are starting to crumble. The neurological echo is returning, and it's stronger this time, more vivid. The patch of static void I see now is not just on a blank wall. It appears over the television screen. It hangs in the air in the corner of my bedroom at night. It is no longer a passive hallucination. It feels active. It feels like it's watching me. The chime, I realize now, wasn't just a signal. It was a seed. They had planted a seed of alien perception in our minds, and while the men in gray had managed to poison the soil, they could not kill the root. And now, at the end of my life, it is finally, terribly, blooming. This is why I am making this tape. In this dusty basement surrounded by the forgotten relics of a life that wasn't mine, I am finally allowing Arthur Corrigan to speak again. I'm using this old reel-to-reel recorder, a machine I haven't touched in decades. The familiar weight of the reels, the satisfying click of the tape threading into place. It feels like coming home. I have to tell this story. Not for fame, not for revenge, but because of what that final chilling piece of advice from the man in gray truly meant. Humanity is not ready, he said. And he was right. We aren't. Our brains, our senses, our very understanding of reality is a fragile, delicate thing, evolved to perceive a sliver of the electromagnetic spectrum on a tiny, wet rock orbiting an unremarkable star. We are not equipped to look into the true, vast, terrifying complexity of the cosmos. The chime was a glimpse into that complexity. It was a stray thought from a being or a process whose existence is as far beyond ours as ours is beyond that of an amoeba. It wasn't a message for us. We were just unlucky enough to be standing by the side of the road when it drove past. My colleagues, we were the canaries in the coal mine of perception. We flew too close to a new kind of sun, and it burned our minds to ash. What NASA, what the powers that be, are hiding is not a crashed saucer or an alien body. It's not something you can put in a hangar at Area 51. It's a piece of information. It's the terrifying, world-shattering knowledge that there are things in the universe that we are not only incapable of understanding, but that the mere attempt to understand them can destroy us. They are protecting us from a truth that our minds simply cannot handle. And so, I am finishing this tape. My story is told. The static void is shimmering in the corner of the room even now, deeper and darker than ever before. It feels close. It feels patient. I don't know what will happen when it finally consumes my vision completely, but I am no longer afraid. I am just Arthur Corrigan, the audio engineer who heard a sound from Jupiter and saw a hole in the world. I will seal this tape in a box and mail it to a journalist I've been researching, someone young and hungry who still believes in monsters. Maybe they will believe my story. Maybe they won't. It doesn't matter. The telling is what matters. The silence has been broken. I'm reaching now for the stop button on the recorder. The reels will spin to a halt. The tape will hiss into silence, but I know, with a certainty that chills me to my very soul, that the quiet in this room is not an absence of sound. It's just a pause. They gave me a new name, a new life, and told me to forget. But I can't, because sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet, I can still hear the static, and I know it's still listening. So, that's the story of Signal Chime. A story about how the heroic ambition to listen to the universe resulted in a lifelong, terrified silence. It's a reminder that the greatest discoveries might not be things we can touch or see, but ideas or pieces of information so alien they threaten the very structure of the minds that perceive them. Officially, the JPL incident of 1979 was nothing more than equipment failure and mass hysteria. But you and I both know the truth now. They didn't stop listening. They just learned to be terrified of what they might hear. Thank you for watching until the end. If this story made you think or look over your shoulder at that blank spot on your wall, support the channel with a like and subscribe. And be sure to share your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, be careful what you wish for when you look up at the stars. You might just get an answer, and it might be in a color you can't understand.